We often think about pregnancy as this, well, idyllic time maybe,
Yeah.
that sort of quiet glow.
Right, the nesting phase.
Exactly. But honestly, for so many women, it's also a time of pretty significant stress
Mm.
or anxiety, depression.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not a small number we're talking about.
No, not at all. The estimates are, what, up to 15% experiencing actual clinical disorders?
Mm.
And then even more, maybe like a quarter, dealing with just elevated symptoms of distress.
That's right. It's a huge number of people navigating some really tough internal stuff while, growing a whole new person.
And the reasons are so varied, aren't they?
Totally. It's not just hormones and the physical side, though that's definitely part of it.
Sure.
But you've got financial worries, maybe relationship issues, medical things cropping up, work
Yeah.
stress, other kids. It all just kind of piles on.
It's this unique pressure cooker moment.
Exactly. Internal, extra, all converging.
And for a long time, the worry about this distress was mostly focused on the mother, right? Her well-being.
Hmm.
But what the science is really showing now is just how deep and how lasting the impact can be on the baby's development, specifically their brain.
And that's precisely what this deep dive is all about. We're digging into a really comprehensive review article that came out recently in Molecular Psychiatry.
Yeah.
And this isn't just one study. It pulls together a huge amount of research. It gives us a much clearer picture of how maternal stress actually shapes the fetal brain, what that means later in life, how it might be happening biologically, and where we go from here with treatments and research.
So our mission today is really to unpack the key insights from this review for you,
Yeah.
help you grasp how common this is and what the cutting-edge science is actually telling us about this incredibly sensitive time.
Yeah.
So let's start right there, just acknowledging how widespread this distress is and why researchers were concerned even before they could see the brain changes.
Well, those numbers we mentioned, up to 15% clinical, maybe 25% with elevated symptoms, they really hammer home that this is a major public health issue.
It really is.
And the review points out that even looking just at the pregnancy itself, maternal distress is linked to immediate risks. Things like a higher chance of preterm birth or the baby having a lower birth weight.
Right, which can set the stage for challenges from day one.
Exactly. So the concern is layered. It's for the mother, it's for the pregnancy outcome, and as we'll get into, it's definitely for the baby's developing brain.
Okay, so let's talk about the science that lets us even see the fetal brain. Because
Yeah.
looking inside the womb, it sounds almost like science fiction. How on earth do they manage that?
Well, normal fetal brain development is just this incredible explosion, especially later on, third trimester, massive growth organization.
Right.
And traditionally, we really only had ultrasound, which is great for basic anatomy, but it doesn't give you the kind of detailed look at structure and function researchers needed for this.
So what changed? What was the breakthrough?
It's really down to advances in MRI, specifically ultra-fast MRI techniques. See, standard MRI is just too slow. A fetus moves too much. But these really rapid sequences can grab images much, much faster.
Before the baby wiggles too much.
Exactly. Or they use really clever computer processing to correct for the movement afterwards. And this lets them measure things non-invasively, like overall brain size, the volume of specific areas, how the cortex, the outer layer is folding.
Wrinkly surface.
Yeah, that complex folding process. They call it gyrification and sulcal depth. And they can even look at something called functional connectivity.
Functional connectivity. Okay, that sounds like how different parts of the brain are talking to each other. Is that right?
That's exactly it. They use something called resting state fMRI. It basically shows which brain areas tend to be active at the same time. It suggests they're communicating, working together in networks.
Wow, so you're actually seeing the conversations starting up in the developing brain.
Kind of, yeah. You can track regions growing, see these early networks forming. It's an amazing window.
That's incredible.
Now, it's still tricky, don't get me wrong. Fetal movement is always a challenge. And some of those really small, important structures, like the amygdala or hippocampus, they're hard to see perfectly clearly.
I can imagine.
And understanding exactly what the fetal brain signals mean compared to an adult brain is still an active area of research. But even with those challenges, the tech is revealing some really striking impacts from maternal distress.
Which brings us right to those structural changes they're seeing.
Yeah.
What does the research say about how maternal distress physically changes the developing brain?
Well, the review makes it clear these changes aren't just fleeting. They can be detected quite early, actually during the pregnancy.
In utero.
In utero, and then right after birth, and crucially, they seem to persist into childhood, even adulthood. It leaves a long shadow.
Can you give us some specifics? What parts of the brain are affected?
So prenatally, using that fetal MRI, studies have linked higher maternal distress to smaller volumes in areas like the hippocampus and the cerebellum.
Okay, hippocampus for memory, cerebellum for motor control, learning.
Right, really core areas. But interestingly, they've also seen increased volume in the brainstem and changes in how that cortex is folding, sometimes showing more complex folding, increased gyrification.
So it's not just everything shrinking, it's specific regions growing differently.
Exactly. Different patterns. And these patterns seem to continue after birth. In newborns, kids, you see findings like reduced overall brain volume, especially the gray
The
matter.
processing centers.
Right. And a thinner cortex in key areas like the frontal and temporal lobes areas vital for, executive function, managing emotions.
Okay.
And those stress-sensitive spots we mentioned, the amygdala and hippocampus, they definitely show altered volumes. Now, this is where it gets a bit complex.
How so?
Well, the studies sometimes report conflicting findings. Sometimes these areas look larger in kids exposed to prenatal stress, sometimes smaller.
Wait, larger and smaller. How does that work? What explains the difference?
It probably reflects just how complex stress is. The effect likely depends heavily on when the stress happened during pregnancy, what kind of stress it was, anxiety, depression, chronic stress.
Right.
The severity matters, the child's age when they're scanned, even the child's sex can play a role.
Oh, okay.
But the key takeaway is that these structural changes are happening. They're detectable, they're being tracked. Prenatal distress is physically altering the brain's architecture right from the start.
That's a really powerful point, is changing the building blocks.
Yeah.
Now, what about going deeper than just size and shape? What about the wiring, the chemistry, how regions connect?
Yeah, the research definitely goes there. They look at the brain's microstructure. You can think of the white matter as like the brain's fiber optic cables connecting everything. Microstructure is about how healthy and organized those cables are.
Okay, like the quality of the wiring.
Pretty much. They use techniques like DTI diffusion tensor imaging, which measures things called fractional anisotropy, FA, and mean diffusivity, MD. Changes here suggest those white matter fiber, the connections, aren't forming or organizing quite the same way. It affects how efficiently signals travel.
And which cables seem most affected by maternal distress?
They're seeing changes in various tracks, but particularly ones connecting emotional processing areas with the frontal lobes, the bit that does the regulation and control. Pathways like the uncinate fasciculus and the cingulum bundle.
Which makes sense biologically, given its link to psychological distress.
Exactly, it fits the picture.
Okay, so the wiring's affected. What about the actual chemistry inside the brain?
A lot of the super detailed chemistry work is still from animal models, but human fetal studies are starting to give us clues using something called MRS magnetic resonance spectroscopy.
Okay.
And the review mentions studies finding lower levels of important brain chemicals, metabolites like creatine and choline in the fetal brain when the mother reports higher stress or depression.
Creatine and choline. Why are they important? What do they do?
Think of them as like essential building blocks or fuel for brain cells. They're involved in energy use, keeping cell membranes healthy, making neurotransmitters.
So lower levels might mean?
It suggests the basic metabolic machinery that supports brain growth and function might be running differently, maybe less efficiently. And here's something really interesting the review pointed out.
Yeah.
These chemical changes might actually show up before the structural changes are obvious.
Wow, so chemistry first, then structure. That could be a really early sign.
Potentially, yeah. An earlier indicator of impact.
And what about the communication piece, that functional connectivity you mentioned earlier?
Right. This is where we see those altered conversations. Functional connectivity looks at how synchronized the activity is between different brain regions. And the review clearly shows maternal anxiety or stress is linked to changes in these communication patterns, these networks in the fetal brain.
Changes in communication networks before the baby's even born. That's just wild.
It really is. They're seeing differences in networks involving areas like the sensorimotor cortex, association areas, and those limbic structures like the hippocampus. For example, connections that develop early might be sort of abnormally strong, while ones that develop later might be weaker.
So stress isn't just changing the size of things. It's influencing how the brain actually wires itself up to communicate internally.
Yeah.
Especially in emotional and processing areas.
That's the idea. It seems to be influencing the construction of that internal communication system, particularly in areas crucial for early sensation processing and later complex thought and emotion regulation.
And do these altered connections stick around after birth?
It seems so, yes. Studies in infants and children keep finding these altered patterns. For instance, they see changes in how the amygdala, the brain's threat detector, communicates with the prefrontal cortex, the regulation center. And what's really compelling is how this connects to other things in the environment. The review mentions studies linking weaker amygdala connectivity in newborns, not just to maternal stress, but also potentially to factors like living in a disadvantaged neighborhood.
So maternal stress might be one way the external environment gets under the skin and affects the baby's brain wiring.
It looks that way. It suggests the brain's stress response systems, the emotional regulation networks, they're being wired differently very early on. And these disruptions seem to continue, potentially impacting how the child processes emotions, remembers things, manages behavior down the line.
It really paints a picture of these deep, fundamental changes to how the brain works together.
Exactly, affecting its interconnected functions.
Now, the review also mentioned something crucial. This impact might not be the same for every baby.
Yes, that's a really critical point. The research strongly suggests the effects of maternal distress can differ depending on the sex of the baby.
Ah, interesting. Sex differences in how prenatal stress affects the brain. Can you give us some examples?
Sure, some studies found certain structural changes, like increases in the volume of the right amygdala, seem to be more pronounced in girls.
Okay.
Other research noted specific changes in that cortical folding pattern that seemed unique to females. Even how maternal cortisol levels relate to the baby's brain connectivity right after birth can show sex-specific patterns.
That's fascinating. Any idea why there would be these differences?
The why is still being figured out. It's complex. It likely involves hormonal differences during development, maybe differences in the timing of brain maturation between boys and girls.
Makes sense.
But the review really underscores that understanding these sex-specific effects is vital. It suggests future research and maybe even interventions might need to take these differences into account to be truly effective. It just adds another layer of complexity.
Okay, so we've got changes in structure, wiring, chemistry, connections, even differences based on sex. Let's connect this all back to the real world now. What does this actually mean for how kids, and maybe even adults, function day to day? What are the consequences?
Right. This is where the brain science meets lived experience. And the review pulls together clear evidence linking these brain differences, the structural, the functional, to lasting neurobehavioral outcomes. We see this through childhood and potentially even into adulthood.
What kinds of outcomes are we talking about?
It's quite a range, unfortunately. Things like cognitive issues, maybe impacting toddler cognition, language development delays, problems with learning and memory. Also, social emotional difficulties, trouble regulating emotions, perhaps. And behavioral issues, particularly what they call externalizing behaviors, like hyperactivity or aggression.
And looking further out.
There's a link noted towards a higher risk for neuropsychiatric conditions later on, like anxiety disorders or depression.
And the research isn't just saying these things are correlated, right? It's suggesting the brain changes might actually be part of the pathway.
That's a key point, exactly. Some studies the review cites suggest that specific brain alterations, like those changes in amygdala volume or cortical thickness or the altered connectivity patterns we discussed, might actually mediate the link.
Mediate, meaning they help explain how maternal distress leads to the later outcome.
Precisely. It suggests the maternal stress isn't just associated with later problems. It might be literally, physically rewiring the baby's brain in ways that actively contribute to those problems developing later.
That's such an important insight. It gives a biological base as a potential target. So how? How does this rewiring actually happen? What are the biological mechanisms bridging mom's stress to the baby's brain?
Yeah, it's not just one simple thing. The review describes it as this complex web of interacting biological pathways.
Okay, can you break down the main ones?
Sure. So one major suspected route is through the placenta.
A lifeline.
Exactly. Maternal distress seems to affect how the placenta functions. This can change the transfer of crucial things to the fetus nutrients, oxygen, but also hormones like serotonin and, crucially, the mother's own stress hormones, cortisol.
And having too much or maybe dysregulated cortisol exposure in the womb affects the baby's brain.
That's the leading theory. This altered hormonal environment is thought to directly influence how fetal brain cells develop and express their genes, which brings us to another key mechanism, epigenetics.
Ah, epigenetics. How the environment can change gene activity.
Exactly. Not changing the DNA code itself, but changing how genes get switched on or off. Maternal distress can trigger these epigenetic changes in the fetus, particularly in genes involved in the stress response system. It's like programming the baby's own stress system differently right from the get-go.
Wow. What else is involved in this complex picture?
The review also mentions potential roles for the microbiome, the gut bacteria and inflammation. Markers of inflammation in the mother, things like IL-6 or C-reactive protein, are linked to distress and have also been associated with pregnancy issues and offspring brain outcomes.
Interesting connection.
Then there's the HPA axis, the body's main stress command center, involving the brain, pituitary, and adrenal glands. Dysregulation of this system in both the mother and potentially the developing fetus seems central.
Okay.
And even things that seem simpler, like how stress disrupts the mother's sleep or appetite, could indirectly influence the prenatal environment and nutrient delivery.
It's a really intricate network of effects, changing the whole internal environment. And the source mentioned this often doesn't happen in isolation.
That's a really important point the review makes. This complexity is amplified because maternal psychological distress rarely occurs alone. It often overlaps with other challenging circumstances.
Like what?
Things like low socioeconomic status, poor nutrition, exposure to pollution or other toxins. All these factors can interact, or they might even trigger some of the same biological pathways like inflammation or HPA axis changes.
Making it hard to pinpoint just one cause.
Exactly. It's likely more of a cumulative burden, a combination of hits.
And we also need to remember, the stress might not just disappear once the baby arrives.
Absolutely, critical point. Maternal distress, unfortunately, can often continue into the postnatal period. And this can then affect the parent-child relationship, the bonding, the interaction style.
Creating a potentially more stressful environment after birth.
Right, which then layers on top of any prenatal effects, further shaping the child's development and potentially increasing the risk for those behavioral and emotional issues. It's a continuous, complex story.
Okay, so given everything we've discussed, this profound impact, these complex mechanisms, what can actually be done, what about treatments now? And where does the science point for the future?
The review covers the main treatment approaches used currently for maternal psychological distress during pregnancy, primarily pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy.
Let's start with medication. What does the research say there?
Antidepressants, especially SSRIs and SNRIs, are sometimes prescribed. The review acknowledges they can be necessary and helpful for the mother's mental health.
Yeah.
But it also highlights potential risks or effects on the baby identified in some studies. Things like an increased chance of what's called neonatal adaptation syndrome.
Which is?
It's basically temporary withdrawal-like symptoms in the newborn right after birth, irritability, feeding issues, sometimes breathing trouble that need medical attention. There's also a possible increased risk of preterm birth noted in some research associated with SSRI use.
Okay.
And the review also mentions studies linking prenatal SSRI exposure to subtle changes in newborn brain structure and microstructure, potential longer-term impacts on neurobehavioral or motor development, and even a possible association with a specific structural issue called Chiari malformations.
So it's definitely a complex calculation, weighing the mother's needs against potential impacts on the baby.
It is. It requires careful consideration and discussion between the woman and her doctor.
What about the non-medication options? Psychotherapy.
Yes, psychotherapy is presented as a really strong, effective, non-drug intervention. Things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or IPT, interpersonal psychotherapy.
How do they help?
They help women manage anxiety or depression by changing negative thought patterns, improving coping skills, or addressing relationship difficulties that might be contributing to the distress.
And does helping the mother with therapy actually help the child's outcome too?
Yes, that's a really positive finding highlighted in the review. Providing psychotherapy to distressed pregnant individuals seems to have beneficial ripple effects. It can positively impact their children's mental health later on, potentially reducing their risk of anxiety, for example.
That's great news.
Yeah, and the review notes that for mild to moderate depression, therapy can be just as effective as medication, and often people are more likely to stick with it, lower dropout rates.
Any other approaches mentioned?
Yeah, complementary things like mindfulness practices, exercise, yoga, even just ensuring good sleep hygiene are mentioned as potentially helpful supports alongside therapy or on their own for milder symptoms.
So looking forward now, based on all this research, what are the big calls to action? Where do we need to go?
Well, a huge takeaway from the review is the urgent need for routine mental health screening for everyone during pregnancy and the postpartum period.
Just make it standard practice.
Absolutely. Because right now, a really significant number of women who are struggling are going completely undiagnosed and untreated. We're missing opportunities to help.
That seems so fundamental.
It really is. Beyond screening, the research calls for developing and implementing targeted interventions for women identified as being at higher risk. And even exploring universal prevention strategies, things that could be part of standard prenatal care for everybody to build resilience.
Interesting.
They also emphasize the need for personalized treatments, recognizing one size won't fit all, and really leveraging social support as a known protective factor. How can we bolster that?
And scientifically, where does the research itself need to head?
The big push is for large, long-term studies. We need to follow diverse groups of women and their children over many years, using advanced brain imaging starting right from the fetal period through childhood into
You
adolescence.
really track development.
Exactly. The goal is to build these huge data sets that let us understand individual differences better. Why are some children more affected than others? Can we identify specific brain biomarkers, early patterns, or signals in fetal or newborn scans that predict who might be most vulnerable to later problems?
So spotting something early in the brain that signals a need for extra support later.
That's the hope. It could allow for much earlier, more targeted interventions to support those kids and families.
Makes sense.
And ultimately, the vision is moving towards this really broad, multidimensional understanding. We need to integrate genetics, epigenetics, social factors, environmental exposures, alongside the brain imaging to truly get a handle on the complex dance of factors that shape development, and hopefully find ways to break cycles of intergenerational stress.
So if we were to boil down the core message from this deep dive, it's that maternal psychological distress during pregnancy isn't just common. It's a really significant issue with measurable, profound, and crucially long-lasting effects on the baby's brain and their future behavior.
Absolutely. And it underscores that prioritizing maternal mental health during this critical window isn't just about caring for the mother. That's incredibly important in itself.
Right.
It's equally vital for protecting the long-term neurological health and the overall well-being of the next generation.
It really does make you pause and think about that incredible, intricate process unfolding during pregnancy. Understanding these deep connections between a mother's internal experience and the hidden world of fetal development. It definitely opens doors for potential early help, but wow, it also shines a bright light on how much more work is needed to make sure mental health support is just a standard, accessible part of care for every single person during pregnancy and beyond.